My guest today is Adekunle Oduye, design engineer at Plaid based in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Doing pretty good. How you doing today?
Can't complain, man. The rain is subsided at least for a few days out here in California. We're making a lot of us Californians are making the joke of like, how could we even imagine living in Seattle when we can't even handle 20 days of rain here? But hey, thank you for coming on the show. I'm really excited for this convo because you've had the experience of working between design and engineering. And so you have a really good perspective of really how things work and how teams can start to collaborate. So I'm really excited to get into that. I want to open the show, which I do with all my guests, with few icebreakers. And so the first one that I usually like to start out with, because I get some really interesting responses, is what is something that you're currently obsessed with?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say one of the things like recently is going to museums. So
Mm,
I used to go to museums a lot when I was like a kid and like when I had to do projects like art projects and whatnot.
right.
So like stopped doing it for a while.
Yeah.
And I think literally a month ago, I was like, all right, I need to do something different. So
Uh,
I started looking into like museum memberships because I was like, why do people have like memberships in museums? Like it's sometimes and most of the time it's free and whatnot. But there's a lot of perks, and also you're able to go to the museum when it's not crowded. So I actually bought like
mm,
3 memberships, and I'm like, and I just came from one preview yesterday at the Met Museum, and I'm going to another one in the
okay.
MoMA. That's one thing I'm like
Wow.
super obsessed with right now.
Yeah. Look, New York is the place to be going to museums if you were to have a museum membership. I'm assuming like you generally tend to lean towards like art museums more than others.
A bunch of them, but tours are usually lean towards the more traditional like painting and whatnot, because that's what I used to do when I was in high school, do a lot of canvas paintings and using like acrylic paints
Mm,
on that stuff. I'm not a big fan of art history. I that was like my worst subject in school because like it's all about like memory and whatnot. And I'm like, I'm here to do
yeah.
stuff and not remember. Oh, why did this person use this specific figure or
Right.
whatnot? So yeah, towards like more painting
Yeah.
versus like art history.
Do you have a favorite artist or favorite artists?
Yeah. So yeah, I think Basquiat was one of them because it's like unorthodox way of doing
Yeah.
things. Another is I would say one artist, but anyone that does any pointillism kind of paintings, that's I'm super interested in
Mm,
that because
yeah.
you have to have real patience to do that. I tried to do it a couple of times. I was like, yeah, I don't have the patience, but you could see it, especially where it's like digital art where it's small dots, but you're doing it
Sure.
with the actual with a painting brush, which is like time consuming. So I
Mm,
feel like that those
yeah.
arts are super interesting. So
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Next question. What's top of mind for you right now? There's so much happening in the world. There's a lot happening in our industry. Obviously, AI is a big thing. Is there anything in particular that you've been thinking about recently?
yeah, I think AI is one of those things I'm constantly thinking about because I feel like sometimes there's trends that come and go, and I think AI is here to stay.
Yeah.
So for
Sure.
me, it's to figure out how to use AI in my work. So I don't, I don't want to be like one of those like old school cats where it's like, I don't use that because like I like to use like my how like people back in the day, oh yeah, back in the day, had never had a cell phone. I just used payphone or something like that.
Right.
So I'm trying to
Analog.
like, yeah, so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to like, I know it's here to stay. So figure out how can I use it right now. So I'm exploring ways like, okay, if I'm working in
Mhm.
design systems in like 5, 10 years, how can AI
Sure.
play a role with that? So I'm using
Mm,
ChatGPT and like using other stuff that figuring out how to leverage it and like what use cases would
sure.
be like I could use it for. So yeah, that's like the top of mind for me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating just being able to like type something in the chat GPT and it generate code for you. I know there's a lot of designers that are doing the web design thing, right? I think I saw a designer on my feed the other day that was like doing it to build like loaders and transitions. And so those are things that can help accelerate your work. It's like delegating the things that you may not possibly be good at, but you understand. I think it's important to understand it. Okay. Last question. Not as serious, but when you get into the flow of things, like what's on your playlist?
Oh yeah, good question. So I tend to lean towards more of like lo-fi hip hop when
Yeah.
I'm listening, because I tend to listen to hip hop like before, like with like lyrics or not, and I felt like that was kind of distracting. Sometimes you get into because you be like, especially if your song comes on, you be like, oh, and you just you start to
You
like
get about to hear.
yeah, so it happened a lot, and then, especially like working from home, I gotta control myself. If I was in the office, it'd been different because I'm not like I can't really act the fool up there. But at home, I'd be just a song comes playing, and I'm like get into I'm dancing and stuff, and then I look up and it's oh wait, 20 minutes passed. So I gotta. That's why I do stuff that has no lyrics because it's like super helpful, keeps me focused, but it's also background music. But yeah, that's what I listen to.
No, I feel you on that. It's really funny. I always ask people this question, and I need to stop asking it because everyone literally says lo-fi hip hop for the exact same reason. It's really interesting because I feel like I've gotten to that point too, where I really just can't listen to music that I actually know. It has to be music I've completely never heard of before. That's the only way I can hack it. But look, let's actually hold on. My camera's off focus. What? I've got one of these Opal cameras, man. They are so unreliable. They're so unreliable. They got us with like good design. They got us with really good marketing. And then when we got the product, when it matters most, it just shuts off or it just loses focus. But hey, let's get to know a little bit more about you. Maybe give the listeners just like a brief background in terms of just we'll start to how did you get into design and how did you get into engineering? And I'd love to understand what kind of motivated you to move in between both. Because I think now you're in between both of them, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, a brief history. I studied art throughout like most of my educational life. So it was like art, painting, and whatnot. So I was doing that for from K to 12. And then I really wanted to do it more. And then I think I went to one class and they were like, if you're thinking about doing art, you got to rethink if this is life you want because you're not going to make as
Mm.
much money and whatnot. And then I remember my mom telling me, it's like, how are you going to feed yourself? And I was like, okay, I got to figure out something else that's like creative in the realm and whatnot. So I pivoted to like design. So I studied I took a lot of classes around like communication design, focusing on
Yeah.
typography, color theory, and whatnot.
Yeah.
And then my first role was like a web designer at a small boutique company. And the great thing about that job is like I was doing everything.
Yeah.
And fun fact, they were like, "Oh yeah, do you want to get into code?" My answer in my head, I was like, "No," because I did take like Dreamweaver back in college, and I hated it. So
Throwback.
yeah, it was like people throw. I was like, "Nah, I can't do that. I can't. I just couldn't stand it." So I was forced into it
Well,
because like
to be fair, that app wasn't the greatest either in hindsight.
yeah, but it was like I don't know. I just remember like having to slice up my designs and try to code it. I was like,
Mm.
this thing, this is so bootleg. I was like, I don't want no parts of this. But
Yo, for people that don't know what he's talking about, you were working in Photoshop, right? You were designing the mocks in Photoshop, and then you had to go in and slice the different elements and then export it. And I think the idea was that you would ideally, if it worked, the idea is that you were slicing in Photoshop and you could export it directly in the Dreamweaver. But that was never the case.
yeah, that was basically it. It was like, and I remember questioning. I was like, why am I doing? Because literally, it's like you slice it up and then you have to put it into tables. So everything's a table, and let's say you want
Mm.
to like change like the background or whatever like that. You basically have to like export the whole site again and do it over. It was I don't know how we were like building websites like that, but it was one of the things where I was like, maybe this is not for me. But again, it's like I was forced. I was not forced, but I was like, I was an intern. I was like, all right, whatever they say, I'm just gonna do it. So I was doing a lot of like front end,
Sure.
back end, like e-commerce stuff, and I was like, oh, I got this front end. Once you understand it, but also I wanted to dive deeper into it because I'll have designs and I'd send it to like my developers and they'd be like, yeah, we can't do
Sure.
that. And I was like, can't. I was like, I don't know what that word is. Like you have a
Mm.
like, and this is during the time where it was like people were Amazon, all this stuff. So I was like, they doing some like crazy things out here, but like some people are like, oh, we can't do it. So I think for me was like I needed to really understand the medium I was like dealing with. So like when I was doing
Mm,
print design, I remember taking a trip to the printers and understanding like how they mix paint and how to do all this stuff. So I was like, oh, like I needed to be more versed on like how the web works. So I think that's why I dived in more into the front end world. And I did a lot of like front end projects after that. And then I had the same question where I was like, I hate the idea of someone like telling me like, hey, build this thing out, and then I just do it. So my goal was like, all right, how can I do both? And it was funny
right.
where back in the day, people were like, you can't do both. And I was like, what? You can't like I just didn't understand it.
Yeah.
Like they're speaking like
Yeah.
foreign language to me. And I was like, I'm gonna figure out. I'm gonna do it regardless. And then I think hindsight when people are like, oh yeah, like there is a role, but it's like super hard as like a design technologist and whatnot. Ever since then, like the roles I've had where I'm able to do both design and code, I think it's pretty great. As like a product
Mm,
designer where you just like, all right, this is the design, I'm gonna build it out. You can really build the experience of the user experience overall. Like you can say like, all right, what's the
right.
motion? How the thing's gonna look like when it's loading? What if I'm on like a 3G connection? How that's gonna look?
Right.
And yeah, and then I think another thing that kind of worked out was like design systems is perfect for hybrids. So if you're building a design system, most often not, or most teams don't have a fully fledged team. So usually they will have one person. And I think design system is a
Sure.
perfect place because you're like, all right, you could design it and then you're also in charge of coding things up and whatnot.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been a big ride, like an interesting ride, but I think it's been fulfilling because I think
Oh,
I'm able to talk both languages and able to like
yeah.
interact with anyone. And also I'm able to shift my talents based on the needs of the project. So I think it's
Sure.
very fulfilling, but also like a very tiring work because I think when I first was doing it, I was like burning myself out trying to do everything at once. But I think I have a system and
Mm,
process in place and it's been super helpful.
yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things I can take away from that story, and thank you for sharing, is in the same similar way that you approached studio art and process and understanding these things through all these different moments of these career or role shifts, you took the same approach. And on top of that, you carve your own path. Right. I think that's one of the things I appreciate about the work that we do. There's so many different ways to approach things. And I think it's just getting better and better as the technology improves in the way that and the tools that we use to interact with each other. I want to maybe touch on one piece that you concluded that talk with, and it was around the process. Like, how do you walk in and evaluate your role, considering that the needs of engineer, the needs of design sometimes shift per project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think how I approach it and how like I get the best results is like I think in the context of the problem I'm trying to solve and
Yeah.
what I'm trying
Mm,
to learn and what is the solution. So if the problem
yeah.
is like, all right, I'm gonna be building let's say a financial app clone. Let's say we're trying to build the next Robinhood and whatnot. And before we like do anything or build it out, we want to evaluate like what is feasible, what is like the business use and whatever like that. Based on the problem, it'll let me know like how deep I should go into the design or how deep I should go into the prototyping or how deep I should go into the engineer world. Because again, the problem is driving what I'm doing. So I'm not getting into the details about, oh, what frameworks I should be using, thinking about like the endpoints, all that stuff. I'm like thinking about like, all right, what is the quickest way I can validate this idea? So even for me,
Yeah.
I use like open source toolkits, like design toolkits.
Mm,
I use if I need a database, I always use either Google Sheets or
yeah.
Airtable because it allows you to build stuff quickly. So that's like how I approach it where I first make sure I'm building the right thing and then I'll build the thing. And once I figure out that process, like everything else, like you can able to focus on the things that matter.
Right. So wait, you build basically like an MVP prototype, pretty much throwaway code just to get the idea functioning. Like I'm curious, is this something that only you're looking at? Is this something that you're bringing to a group of people? Like maybe talk to that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Usually I like to create prototypes and it's similar to if I'm drawing something, like before I like
Mm,
decide I'm going to draw this figure, I usually will do some gesture drawing to be able to throw out like as many ideas as possible, and then I could figure out
Yeah.
which idea makes sense. And again, I'm not spending too much time to it. Usually, it's a case where it's like, all right, maybe 30 seconds each, like small sketch, and I'm like
Yeah.
valuing which one I should proceed with. It's the same thing where like with product design or I'm trying to build something. Like my goal is to quickly get to the right solution, and the best way to do
Mm,
that is you're just gonna basically try out as many ideas as possible. And then if you have a team, you can say, hey, here are like the top three options. Option A, this is why I did this. Option B, this is why I did this. And option
mm,
C, this is why I did this. And from based on my experience, people are more likely to give better feedback with prototypes
right.
versus a piece of paper or
Yeah.
whatnot. And I ran into this issue before where people are like, this
Mm,
should be this and this should be that. And I was like, I just literally took a day, I prototyped it out. And then the idea is like the prototype is the vocal point, and people are able to get
sure.
feedback on something that's more tangible. And I think
Mm,
the idea is that once you say like this works, this doesn't work, or whatever like that, and we get to the right thing, then we can say like, all right, cool. Like, how can we make this? And I call it like the productionized phase where it's like, all right, like,
sure.
how can we incorporate our design system, our visual language? Okay, we have to think about like the endpoints and testing, all that stuff. But the idea is
Yeah.
I'm not really concerned about that until I'm at the right solution. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Look, I want to reground that. Let's reground this. You're a design engineer. In many cases, it's actually a fairly new role. And I think we're starting to see a lot more kind of like articles and case studies around how this role is important. And so, like, how would you define a design engineer?
Yeah, I would say like a design engineer is a person that sits in the intersection of design and code. So
Yeah.
they're able to quickly evaluate problems and take ideas from concept to completion.
Yeah. Yeah. So, talking about your journey, it seems like you've had so many different perspective shifts. Do you see this role or the work that you're doing? Do you see that potentially evolving any more over time? And what could something like that look like?
Yeah, I think it's everyone like reaches their has like different journeys, but I know specifically for me,
Sure.
I have to dive in more into like the back end aspect of things because you realize that especially if you go to any application that's like data heavy and whatnot, a lot of it is driven by content and
Mm,
data. And I
right.
think that's like the biggest thing for me, especially like in past projects where it's you are designing stuff, but you're not really using the proper data and whatnot. And then for me,
Yeah.
I've been learning about like what are the best practice of taking data, sanitizing it, and making it something that's useful, and also even
Yeah.
if you like have something that's production data, ideally you don't want to use that in prototypes because they might have like PII information and whatnot. So you want to be
Right.
able to like scrape that and sanitize and whatnot. So I've been learning a lot about like endpoints and how to do that because I think at the end of the day, a lot of these products like Google,
Yeah.
Facebook, the most valuable thing they have is data. So I think really understand like data visualization and even understanding like
Yeah.
data analysis is super important. And again, I'm not trying to be expert at it, but I want to learn enough of it. And I compare it to anything
Yeah.
else where it's I want to learn that 20% that's going to get me 80% there.
Yeah.
I feel like that's the evolution for me and for most people I know.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I actually had a thought about this a couple months ago, but just seems like the idea of like understanding like computation data to your point is going to be just extremely important in terms of just like how folks are approaching design systems. And I still think we're on the early stages because it's really interesting when you start thinking about, you probably can remember this. Design systems used to be literally like the sticker sheet, right? It's, oh, here's the style guide. And I think all of that kind of changed once we started seeing some of the Twitter frameworks, Google material design. And now we've gotten even further than that, right? I think token is a big driving factor as well. And designers are starting to learn about that. But I think like you have a really interesting point about the data piece, because I think with the data piece, that also is really important in terms of providing context as to how somebody might use it or use that app because it tells a story. So thank you for diving into that. If you were to summarize like a role of a design engineer, right? What are some of the core like competencies one might have to be successful?
Yeah, great question. So I think a lot of it is the first thing you have to be very comfortable living in this like ambiguous like stage where
Yeah,
people they like know the direction where they want to go, but they
yeah,
don't know exactly where they want to go. So it's a case where it's I want to go out west, but I'm not sure where I want to go. But I know that
yeah,
I don't want to deal with rain or snow. So it's a case where it's like, all right, cool. I think I know what you want. So let's explore different cities or whatnot. So that's how it compared to, because oftentimes like
yeah,
there's no clear like deadlines and everything like that. And you have to be able to create that yourself.
yeah,
The second thing is you have to be good at project management and really, because I think a lot of times you can get very tied down by the details. You have to be able to say like, all right, this is like where I want to be at this given time, and then reverse engineer the actual
yeah,
timeline, and then be able to say like,
yeah,
all right, this is I have a week to like prototype. I got a week to get some feedback, and then I got another week to build some stuff out. So you have to be very good at that stuff
right,
because if not, then you're gonna just be doing stuff without any purpose.
right.
And then I think the last thing I would say is that be a great communicator and collaborator because
Mm,
again, you're sitting in the intersection of two disciplines. So you have to be
right.
able to interact, talk with people, get feedback, also bring people all together, make decisions and whatnot. And I feel like again, it's not tied to just design engineering role, but I feel like it's super important because you have to like sell your idea and be
Yeah,
able to get people like behind it. So you have to be able to talk with like an engineer, designer, all the way up to a C-suite executive. And I think that's
right.
where you have to be able to learn the language and understand what drives them and be able to
Yeah,
talk their language. So the case where when I'm selling design systems, I sell it differently between who I'm talking to. So with the engineer or designer, I'm like, hey, if you don't want to spend time like building the button over and over again, that's when you use a design system. And then as you
right.
go all the way up to like C level and management, you want to talk about the impact and how much money is saving. So it's hey, the
Yeah,
design doesn't have to like or the developer doesn't have to waste their time building the button, and this often will save them like 20 to 30%, which again will
yeah,
save you like millions of dollars or what like that. So you have to be able to like communicate clearly and understand who you're talking to and speak their language.
yeah. And then I probably imagine too, managing I'm sure you have a healthy tension between design and engineer since you're in between all of that as well. So I think that also takes just a level of understanding. I think to your point, understanding like motivations, obviously understanding what drives them and speaking their language is something that probably plays a part into that. Look, I want to get into some of your initiatives, right? You have a podcast right now. Would love for you to give listeners an idea of that podcast, why you started it, and what is the importance of having a platform like
Yeah, so I think it was like a year and a half ago. I started doing a lot of like mentorship, and I was
Mhm.
constantly getting like the same questions about, oh, how do I get into like design engineer? What does a design engineer do? Whatever like that. And I was like, all right, maybe I just need to do a podcast. So then like anytime people have questions, I could send it to folks so they can learn about it. So I partnered up with one of my friends, Kelly, who was a design engineer at Intuit. And then we go like, all right, let's just do this podcast. And again, we had no idea what we're doing. So we are like, all right, we're just gonna do it and whatnot. And I think it's been receiving it's been gone pretty well. People
Yeah,
have been very receptive to it. And again, our goal is to make sure that it's a one-stop shop for anything design engineer related. So we're talking about design systems, we talk about front end tooling, we talked about inclusive design and whatnot. And I think the idea is it's such a wide range of topics. It's an opportunity to dive deep into specific ones and invite guests and whatnot. Yeah, I think it's a super important, especially when you start to get the same questions. And if there's not resources out there, just create it because you have to think that there's always people out there that have the same questions. And I feel like being
right.
able to give back to the community as much as possible is super important for us.
Yeah. So give us what's the name of it and how many episodes in are you?
Oh yeah. So it's called the Code in Pixels. Right now we have, I think, 12 episodes. And if you want
Okay.
to visit it, it's codeandpixels.fm. We try to release a new episode every month. And then I think the last episode was with Ben Callahan. He's a founder of Sparkbox, and he was talking about design system consulting. So definitely check it out.
Yeah. Awesome. What has the impact been like so far? Have you had folks reach out?
Yeah, we have a bunch of folks reached out, especially people that's like early in the career. Because I
Sure.
think when you're early in career, you're like, I don't know what I want to do. And I think what we try to do is give practical guides and also make sure people understand like the scope of it. Because I think it's hard to like master design. It's hard to like master engineering by itself. And right now we're talking about,
Yeah.
hey, you could do it all and be this unicorn or whatnot. So it's definitely giving people a different perspective on what are the career options out here. And I always tell
Hmm.
people, and what I've been hearing is it's a good way to understand and communicate through stories. So I think a lot of times where we're like
Yeah.
uh, in the podcast, we're talking about stuff we've gone through, the problems, and how
Mm.
then we come up with solutions. So it's a good way to have people learn about the industry without having to dive deep into it first. And it might be for you, it
Yeah.
might not be for you. And I think that's why we created the podcast.
Yeah. I'm assuming there's probably some of that in a reflection of like your own experience, right? Because we think about, I'm assuming we're thinking about the early to mid 2000s, right? There wasn't really a ton of like classes that you could, unless you're at a university. So a lot of it was just walking your own path and just figuring it out.
Yeah, that's why even when I was in school, there was no UX work. There was like no UX courses, whatnot. They were like, "Oh yeah, web design," and then I remember getting to feel I was like, "UX, what is that?" And then someone
Yeah.
was like explained to me like how schools are usually 5, 6 years behind or more. It's sometimes you just have to you see what's like where the industry is going, and you just have to learn about it. And I think even now, I think a lot of some course they start offering like hybrid roles or hybrid courses in colleges and whatnot, which I think is cool. But I think for me, it's always you're gonna learn best by doing. That's how I learn. I'm just gonna. I was like, all right, I'm gonna build this thing. I have no clue how I'm gonna build it, but I'm just gonna figure it out. But it's always great to have courses and more resources that's dedicated to this role and discipline because I feel like
Yeah.
it's a super important role. It's difficult, but I feel like if you're able to take any idea from concept to completion or even just very close, you'd be very valuable to any organization. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Look, you also do speaking. Do you have any speaking engagements coming up?
Yeah. So I have two next month. I think at the May 18th, I'll be speaking at Converge, which is a conference in San Francisco
Okay.
sponsored by Zero Height. I'll be talking about evolution of design systems and whatnot. So I might be talking about some AI, chat,
Uh,
GBT, and all this other stuff. And
yeah.
then I have another conference in, I think it's in June, and I'm spacing out the name, but I'll definitely get it's, I know it's in Wisconsin. Oh, that conference.
Oh,
It was
nice.
that conference in Wisconsin. I'll be talking about best practices for creating a React design system library.
Amazing. Amazing. Look, we'll put those links in the show notes. Excited about AI and design systems. I know we didn't get into it too much. We touched on it very briefly, but excited to hear more about that. But again, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're at time. Is there anything that you wanted to leave with the listeners before we log off?
Yeah, so I think one thing I want to communicate to folks is that don't be afraid to try new things. You're gonna try things and it's gonna be frustrating and it's gonna feel down about yourself. But I think that's like anything. You're gonna suck at first. I'm assuming Michael Jordan sucked at basketball at a certain point, and then he kept on working on it, and then he became the best of all time. So I think that's been like my process is like try new things. It's okay to you suck at it, but having the motivation to go through it, that's when you're gonna actually learn new things and then be able to innovate and create better ideas and projects. Yeah.
How could folks find you on the internet?
It's actually pretty easy. It's my first name, last name ever. So adekunleoduye.com. I use the same handle on Twitter, Instagram, and also LinkedIn. I also have a newsletter. So if you go into my site, you'd be able to sign up for that. I'm gonna be working on a couple of open source projects, but also a couple of ideas I've been tinkering with for the past, couple of months. So um, yeah, that's how you can stay in touch.
I love it. Look, we've had Adekunle, a leading voice in design engineering, on the show. And I love the fact that you are always testing and creating and sharing new things. Hopefully that provides folks with some motivation to dive in a little bit deeper. Appreciate you and good luck with like your future speaking engagements. Have a good one.
Thanks for having me. See ya.